We'll say hello to YouTube. We'll be getting the music started, letting everybody in here in just a second. Thank you all for joining us. We are the Veterans Breakfast Club. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first Greatest Generation Live of 2025. Great to see you all. Happy New Year to everyone. My name is Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. And our host tonight, Glenn Flickinger. Glenn, how are you doing this evening?
Doing excellent. Really happy to be back on the job again after what seems like a month-long break.
Yes, it felt like a very long break. It's nice to be back. Feels good to be flying again. I see some great new faces here in the room. Even Brad Washabaugh is joining us again, so he must be feeling better. It's good to see him. Joe Conroy, you look like you have a lot of very interesting stuff going on in the background there.
Yes, thank you.
That's excellent. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. You seem like you're new to the VBC.
Yes, I was invited in light of tonight's context of the meeting.
Excellent. Well, for everyone new to us, so we are the Veterans Breakfast Club, and our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing it for 16 years. And you can find out a lot more about us on our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org. On there, you can check out all of our past programs. I'll chime in a little bit later with sort of a little station break, tell you a little bit more about what new programs we have coming up. You can check out that on our website as well. We invite you all to come and be donors of the VBC, help us keep the lights on, as we say here in the nonprofit world. But without further ado, I'm sure we have a lot of really great stuff to get to tonight, Glenn.
Yep, we do. We do. It's a pleasure to be back. If there are some new faces on, my name's Glenn Flickinger. I host this every Thursday night, almost every Thursday night program called Greatest Generation Live, basically all things World War II, where we interview veterans. Last year, I think I interviewed at least 8 or 9 veterans, plus Todd interviewed a few others, World War II veterans. We're talking World War II veterans, which obviously is getting harder to find people that we can interview. But lots of authors and lots of experts on various topics about World War II. So without any further ado, we're going to get into our topic for tonight, which basically is German POWs in the USA. We're going to touch on some of the Italian and Japanese stories as well. But this came up with Carole Popchock. Carole, say hello, please.
Hi, everybody.
Carole's one of our longer term, more devoted, loyal, active, intelligent, charismatic VBC members. I couldn't think of any more adjectives to add on there, Carole. Carole actually has a history degree in her background, and she's been on two history degrees. There you go. And we've had her on before about various topics, I think the 15th Air Force and your family members that flew with the 15th Air Force, that sort of thing. Okay. And then we also have David Smith. David, please say hello. Give us a wave.
Hello, everybody.
Okay. David, it's a pleasure to have you. David is with the Cumberland County Historical Society, and in a little bit, we'll explain why that's important. David actually is going to be kind of the primary guest to talk about something called the Pine Grove Furnace Interrogation Center, which was in Cumberland County. And it had a life before that too, which David's going to touch on tonight. So David, thank you very much for being on.
Good to be here.
So just a little bit of background. So last year we spent probably 3/4 of our programming talking about the 8th Air Force, actually the air war over Europe, not just the 8th Air Force. And that sort of, sprang out of the Master of the Air program that was on Apple. Still is on Apple. It's still there if you want to go see it. Of course, you wait a couple of years, it'll be on Netflix and you won't have to pay for it. Still an excellent program, but we must have done 25 or 30 programs on it. And a lot of them were about American POWs in Germany. Marilyn Walton. I don't know, is Marilyn on tonight by chance? Do you see Marilyn Walton anywhere in the audience? I didn't think about.
I haven't seen Marilyn pop in as of yet, but yeah, I don't see her yet.
So Marilyn Walton is the absolute expert on the POW camps in Germany during World War II. Her father was a POW. She's written or edited many books. But in one of those discussions, Carole Popchock asked a question. What was the question you asked, Carole?
I think I emailed you, Glenn, and I said, I was very moved by the discussion tonight, but it left me wondering how Axis POWs were treated compared to how Allied POWs were treated. And you said, sounds like something you should research. And so it began.
There you go. And that was probably 5 or 6 months ago.
But yeah, and I did tell Glenn that I had remembered my mother, who had worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, commenting on how many POW trains came through in the war years and the special instructions they got as employees about what they could and couldn't do when those trains came through. And she described it as morning, noon, and night. POW trains were coming through Pittsburgh on the Pennsylvania Railroad. So we knew there was a story there somewhere, right, Glenn?
Right. And Carole did some great research, uncovered this Pine Grove Furnace interrogation camp and so forth. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a short 10-minute overview on POWs in Germany, or POWs in the United States, mostly German, just sort of a broad picture, okay? And then we're going to ask David to do a presentation on the Pine Grove Interrogation Center, which he is deeply knowledgeable about from a book he's written and a book he helped to write. And then Carole will come on, and she has an interesting story about Bedford Springs and the Japanese diplomatic corps that was interred there right at the end of the war. So let me pull up my PowerPoint, and remember, it's been 3 or 4 weeks since I've done this, so I'll probably muck it up, but let me try.
While you're pulling that up, I believe I saw Ed Cottrell enter the room.
Ed, how are you, Ed?
I haven't been able to unmute him yet, but no, he is with us tonight. World War II P-51 pilot?
P-47.
He's 47. I was going to say 47, and then my brain said, no, say 51. But yes, Ed, thank you so much for joining us. And I do see, Valerie, you already had a question there in the chat. We will get to that shortly.
Ed, thank you for being on. We'll talk to you a little bit later too. So I just want to, right up front, pay homage to this book, which Carole found, and David had a hand in researching and writing with the author, a man named John Paul Bland, 20-ish years ago, Secret War at Home, and it's the story of the Pine Grove Furnace interrogation camp. To have that time frame about right, David, about 20-some years ago?
Actually, 2006.
2006. Not too far off. It is 2025 now.
Yeah.
David, you also, if you can hold it up for us, you are the author of a book about the Pine Grove. Give us an idea what that's about.
You'll hear more about it when I do my talk, but we got a grant back in 2011 to develop the site so it was more accessible. And part of that was to develop a walking tour. So there are 30 numbered sites, and I wrote the walking tour book that leads you through the site. You can do it on your own with this book, or occasionally we do official tours up there that I lead.
Excellent, excellent. And David will go through a bit of the history of the camp itself, because it has a history before it became a POW camp. Okay, so here's a broad overview of POWs in the United States. This is a shot, believe it or not, when I first saw it, I couldn't believe it, of a POW camp in the United States. And I didn't believe it because you see the swastikas in the background. So that was permitted per the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention plays a big role in this story, signed by the U.S. and Germany. And one of the questions we'll get into is to what degree did we follow the rules of the Geneva Convention? I was doing some reading beforehand. It's actually the Geneva Conventions, plural, and it's actually the third convention which deals with the prisoner of war status, and that was agreed to after World War I in 1929. So, but by rules of the Geneva Convention, that could be shown. Okay, so let's talk some numbers. And the numbers are approximate. You go to a dozen websites and you'll get half a dozen different answers on these. So please take these with a grain of salt. But there were about 425,000 Germans in U.S. prisoners of war camp. None, obviously, until late 1942, 43. And even those came from Great Britain. Great Britain was overrun with German prisoners. And they asked us, as soon as we came into war, to take on at least 100 plus thousand of them pretty quickly in 42 and early 43. The bigger numbers start coming when the U.S. gets active in North Africa, begins taking prisoners there, Italy, and then, of course, the war in Northwest Europe. That's when more and more numbers start coming. There were 51,000 Italians held as prisoners of war in the United States. And there were, and this is kind of suspect to me because it's such an exact number, 5,424 Japanese prisoners of war. What's interesting is, in total, there were only 35 to 50,000 Japanese taken prisoner during World War II. And I think we all know their Bushido Creed, don't surrender, Banzai Charge, all that. That's why so few were taken. But there were a few thousand in the States, and there's a handful that we'll talk about that were at Pine Grove. The other interesting fact that you'll see is that let me find a way to advance this. The first group of prisoners that came in 42 and early 43 were the most ardent German Nazis. Okay, not all were, but among them were many hardcore Nazis. And you see here them at one camp, actually probably outside of a camp in a workforce, giving the Heil Hitler salute, which again, per the Geneva Convention, they were permitted to do, had to be permitted to do. The other thing, at the beginning of the war, when they started to come in, particularly those from the UK, we did not sort them out. Excuse me, we did not sort them out by those who were hardline Nazis, those who were not, those who were pacifists, et cetera, et cetera. Again, partly because of the Geneva Convention, which says you have to treat all these prisoners the same. You can treat officers different than enlisted men, but basically you have to treat them all the same. That became a problem as 42 and especially 43 came on. The hardline Nazis would take vengeance against the basic German prisoners who really didn't care about the Nazis. And if you weren't cooperating with the hardline Nazis, you were punished, to the extent that there were at least 6 murders in the POW camps, Germans killing Germans. There were 2 forced suicides, and this other number is kind of interesting. There were 43 voluntary suicide. So that number, voluntary, is a rather suspect, right? But all of them were German deaths at the hands of other Germans, right? There was eventually then they began to separate the hardcore Nazis out, and there was a special camp established for Nazi incorrigibles in Oklahoma. David will talk a little bit more about the interrogation process at the fort at Pine Grove that came about because of that. Next little slide here. They were put to work. That is okay by the Geneva Convention. It's approved by the Geneva Convention. American prisoners worked both in Germany and Japan. This fellow's working at some sort of machine shop, it looks like. Many of them worked as farm laborers. Tens of thousands worked as farm laborers. The only rule was they could not work in a war industry. And frankly, I don't think we'd want them working in a war industry ourselves. Okay. This I found rather interesting. So there was a program developed. They called it the Factory. And it was a relatively secret program where we were teaching these Germans. We were basically trying to de-Nazify them, if you will, to bring their views into line with reality rather than what they were taught in Germany. We exposed them to books that were banned in Germany. There were films that were shown, et cetera, et cetera. That program, I don't know how big that program was, but it came about in 1944, from what I read. This is a shot of Germans coming on to a train, just as they would have, I suppose, like Carole said, at Pennsylvania Station in Pittsburgh. And the point that we want to make here is that there was definitely, and by the way, going back to the original statistics, there were at least 500 and some, if not 700 and some, separate POW camps in the United States. That number varies widely from source to source. And I think some of it is dependent on what dates you look at. I also think some of the early camps maybe which were kind of small and put up real quickly, or just occupied some building, were then taken down or collapsed, and larger camps were built as time went on. So a lot of camps spread all over the United States, many of them in the South and out West, but a lot in Pennsylvania, as you'll hear in a second, okay? But there is definitely a not in my neighborhood kind of attitude at times. There was a lot of sort of fantastic stories going around about German prisoners getting out and murdering people. There was, obviously, as the war went on and the American casualties mounted, there was some, vengeance, if you will, that was put out there. And actually, there was a lot of complaints that the Germans in the POW camps were eating better than our citizens, that they had more rations and so forth. And the U.S. Government actually did back off on the rations and made a big deal out of it at some point. Although the Germans would tell you that they still ate many times better than if they could have eaten in Germany at any point in time. Okay. Next slide here. So there were escapees. In fact, there were 2,224 escape attempts, actual escapes, more escape attempts, actually 2,224 successful escapes. The biggest one was in New Mexico, where 12 German prisoners built a tunnel under their barracks and escaped out of the tunnel into the countryside. Kind of the Nazi or the German version of the Great Escape that's so famous out of Stalag Luft III in 1944. All 12 of those men were eventually captured. In fact, out of the 2,224, every single one was captured except one. Which is an interesting story, which really surprised me when I ran across it. A POW named George Gaitner, who escaped in September of 1945, so after the war is over. And the reason he tried to escape is that he knew he'd be going back to Eastern Germany, and he had been a former Nazi. And he was afraid that if he sent back to Eastern Germany, the Russians would put him in a camp there, send them to the Stalag. So he escaped, and he made his way to California. Now, he spoke fluent English, which I'm sure was a big, big plus, right? Started working in the fields, working odd jobs, etc. Eventually, he settles, let me get this right here. He settles on the West Coast, and he was even a ski instructor for a while. And he landed a job as a salesman in Oakland, California. And he married an American woman named Jean, and he went by the name Dennis Wiles, right? In 1964, he married. And of course, he never told his wife who he was for real, told her that he had been orphaned young and had no idea who his family was. So he continues on like that until 1984, when his wife is filing for retirement and needs his birth certificate. Excuse me. And that's when he comes clean and he turns himself into the immigration services. He is not arrested. In fact, he goes on the Today Show with Bryant Gumbel as a guest celebrity, and he's interviewed on the Today Show, and he lives the rest of his life out successfully in the United States. And then just the last couple of slides. Sure, these Black American soldiers, there are lots of stories. I'm sure many of you have heard how African Americans in the United States felt that the German POWs were treated better than their own soldiers were being treated, and they were off fighting in the war. Stories of soldiers coming home from Europe and seeing German POWs eating in a railroad restaurant that they could not eat in, things like that. And it caused quite a stir. Here in the Pittsburgh, of course, there's the famous Pittsburgh Courier, which was one of the most influential African-American newspapers of the time. And there's many, many stories in there. And then the final slide, some misconceptions that I had. The war ends. There's 400 and some thousand German prisoners in the United States, plus the Italians. And I always had heard that a lot of German prisoners of war stayed in the States. They liked it so much. They got friendly with some American families out on the farms and that sort of thing, and they stayed in the States. The reality is no. Truman passed a regulation or announced that all POWs had to go back to their home countries. So no Germans, no Italians, no Japanese that were prisoners of war stayed in the United States after the war. What did happen with German prisoners of war is they went back to Germany. Many of them were treated very poorly by the French. A lot of them ended up in French prisoner of war camps for 2-3 years after the war and worked very hard. What did happen is that several thousand of those POWs did come back starting in 1947 through a program that was established. And in fact, about 500,000 Germans immigrated into America between 1947 and 1960. Of course, conditions in Germany were just terrible in the late 40s and early 50s. And that would be part of the reason. So that's just a basic overview of it all. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. Any questions or David, any comments? You're so knowledgeable about all of this. Anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a good overview. I will give one example of an escape from Pine Grove. It's kind of amusing. 2 German prisoners faked an illness serious enough that the medical facility on the in the prison didn't feel they could handle them, so they sent them to Carlisle Barracks, which at that time was the Medical Field Service Hospital Training Center, and they escaped from there. So from that time on, if any prisoners were sent to that particular medical facility, they took their pants away.
I guess I would stop your cold, right?
Wouldn't get very far.
Especially in the winter, you know.
It'd be easy to find.
Yeah. Anything in the chat room or questions from the audience, Sean?
Yes, I'm going to ask Barb here to unmute herself because we have sort of 2 special guests that were joining us particularly for this conversation tonight. And Barb, you put them in the chat. I wanted you to introduce them. We may be able to get to maybe a little bit more about both of them later, but let's see here. Barb, I asked you to unmute. Go ahead, Barb.
Thank you.
Who's joining?
Thank you. This is a fantastic topic. So my husband and I live in Oberlin, Ohio, which is about 15 miles west, maybe, of Amherst, Ohio. Amherst is a sandstone. There's a historic sandstone village in Amherst, and I want to introduce you to 2 gentlemen who play a big part in historical activities in Amherst, Ohio. Joe Fott, F-O-U-G-H-T. He is a 26-year Army veteran, I believe, and he is sitting in a POW barracks at the historic Sandstone Village right now. That's where he's viewing this program from. So Joe is here tonight, and another Joe Conroy, is wearing his uniform. He is quite the reenactor in the Sandstone Village for A Taste of History, which happens on Father's Day weekends. He portrays a German POW, and he has done pencil sketchings of wartime activities by his little bed in the barracks, which was originally a German POW barracks, which they'll tell you about. And he also participates in reenactments as a German soldier at D-Day Conneaut and many other activities. So those are the two gentlemen. And also today, in preparation for this wonderful topic, I, by chance, met Matt Rector. Matt Rector is from Fort Knox, Kentucky. He recently moved up here in Amherst, and he has a lot of information for you to know. I won't give his information away like I just did the other two. So yeah, I'm just thrilled to have met Matt today for the first time and know Dave, Joe, and Joe. So thank you for letting me introduce them.
Yeah, thank you very much to all three of you, Joe, and Matt. Thank you for being on. We'll see if we can't bring you into the conversation here as David goes through his Pine Grove furnace presentation, and we'll try to get some comments from you. Okay, we'll stop for questions now and then as it is, so feel free to bring up a question at that time. So I'm going to ask David. Let's see. We need to make sure David has the ability to put his PowerPoint up. Sean?
David, I'll make you co-host. You're good to go. Here, I'll have Joe and Joe unmute, and Matt Richter, I'll ask you to unmute as well. If you have, there we go. You guys have any thoughts as we go through or questions?
Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint?
We can't see it right now, David. If you may need to reshare it.
Okay.
Did.
It's showing on my screen.
Yeah, it's worked the past two times you and I have we've been through this. So
I need to plug this into the other.
share.
We could also, David, if we're having problems with it, you could either quickly email it or pop it into the chat, and I could pull it up. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Coming up.
You have it now?
There we are. Yep, that's there. So we just need to have you hit the slideshow and yep, start from the beginning. You're good to go.
Okay, now we're good.
Perfect.
Yep.
Terrific. I'd sort of like to orient you to where you are in Pennsylvania. This is South Central Pennsylvania, and give you a perspective on where this prison camp was located. On my screen, those of you who are participating is covering up the right-hand side, but that's where Harrisburg is, over on this edge of the county. Shippensburg over on this side. This is North Mountain, South Mountain. So it's basically a valley community. Route 81 today goes this way across the county. The Turnpike goes this way across the county. So it's a major transportation hub for the whole country. To zoom in a little bit more on the section of this map, this is an 1872 map. This shows where the Pine Grove Furnace community was located. So the industry occurred here. It eventually took over 60 square miles of South Mountain, and it needed farms to support the efforts that the industry was doing. And it eventually acquired 5 farms, one of which was this one. And this is where the camp is eventually located. This is what the iron industry looked like. It was an open pit mine, and there were several other pits, but this was the primary one. And after the iron industry failed in the late 19th century, there was a brickworks put into the facility, and this painting was done of the facility while the brickworks was in operation. But by 1913, that also failed, and the entire compound or area, the 60 square miles, was purchased by the state of Pennsylvania. So this area basically becomes Michaud State Forest, And this area right where Pine Grove is the Pine Grove State Park. This is the farm as it appeared when the state purchased it. You can see at this point the barn has burned, but the stone walls are still there. The farmhouse was left. When the CCC and later the POW camp comes in, the farmhouse is the only thing that is still there, with the exception of one wall of the barn. And this is what POWs would have seen. This is what CCC men would have seen. This is what church camp later on would have seen. So that leads us up to this establishment of a civilian conservation corps at this site. The reason for many of the CCC camps during the Great Depression, they were located in places that had in some ways been abused, and the iron industry had abused the forest. The charcoal was used to fire the furnace. It took an acre of trees a day to run that furnace. So the mountains in the area were pretty much stripped of their trees. So this was a likely place for conservation efforts to be taken on. One of the first things they did was to build a road to get up to the camp. Prior to that, it was an old farm road that was very difficult to navigate. And that's what the camp looked like at the time that it was at its height as a CCC camp. I like to point out two buildings. This building, you'll see later on during the POW area, becomes the headquarters building where the head of the camp lived. And this is where the senior officers lived. And this building was also very important. It was the forestry office during the CCC era. This is the building that was converted for use as an interrogation center when the POW camp came in. So the camp closes as a CCC camp in early 1942. The military is now looking for places to put all of these prisoners that are coming in, the ones that Glenn mentioned coming from England. And then as efforts were successful, German and Italian and occasionally Japanese prisoners were also brought to this country for the duration of the war. The initial intention for what had been Pine Grove Furnace CCC camp was to turn it into an internment camp. Folks from a nearby Letterkenny Army Depot came in and they converted the camp. They created two compounds, one for the enlisted men, one for the officers, and that was according to Geneva Conventions. However, before it ever opened as an internment camp, decision was reached that they needed additional centers for interrogation purposes. The initial places selected were Fort Hunt, just south of Washington, and Byron Hot Springs on the West Coast, north of San Francisco. They couldn't, particularly the Fort Hunt program, could not handle the volume of prisoners, and so they looked for a third site. The site needed to be close to a military installation. In this case, it was Carlisle Barracks. It also needed to be within reasonable distance of Fort Hunt and of Washington, and this site met both of those requirements. So it was the one selected to become an interrogation center. This is, well, come on here. This is the interrogation building here. And these are the original barracks buildings. But as the camp continued to develop, this is what it looked like by 1945. So there were two more barracks built here, each holding 100 prisoners, and 5 more barracks built over here. This is what the camp looked like in 1945. And one thing you'll notice in particular interest, of course, you have the double fencing, 4 guard towers around this major compound. And this was added in late 1945 or early 1945 to split the camp in half. And this half then becomes the place where prisoners from Japan were bought just right at the end of the war. This is the main camp, the entrance. This is the building from the CCC era that was converted to a mess hall for the Germans. So this kitchen L was added to the building. This is the interior of the recreation building as designed by the CCC and then converted for use by the military. They totally upgraded the appearance of the inside of it. U.S. Army star located here. And this is the symbol of the 3rd Service Command. 3rd Service Command was responsible for running the camp. They would take care of transportation, food, guarding. All of those issues were taken care of by the 3rd Surface Command. The actual interrogations were done by the Military Intelligence Service. Sometimes, because of the number they were trying to interrogate, they brought up some of the interrogators from Fort Hunt. Fort Hunt, interestingly, at the same time that we were developing this more in-depth history of what happened at Pine Grove, we're doing the same thing with Fort Hunt. It was now part of the National Park Service, and they located 16 of the original interrogators, which were primarily escaped German Jews. So they had flawless English, or flawless German, and were very good at getting information from the German prisoners. The English had learned, and the Americans continued this. They did not use harsh interrogation techniques. They might have used trickery, particularly with these speakers of German, and they definitely used alcohol. Particularly, there are stories at Byron Hot Springs of taking Japanese prisoners into San Francisco and wining and dining them and loosening tongues in that manner. It's an overview of the camp. That's the mess hall for the staff. And this is, in this picture, he's Lieutenant Lawrence Thomas. He was the person that ran the camp. He became a captain, and then eventually he's a major. He was assigned to one of the internment camps in Gettysburg, at the edge of the Gettysburg battlefield, but he also was in charge of running the program up at Pine Grove Interrogation Camp.
And he came out of the MP, the military police.
That's correct. He was a military policeman. When he retired, he was greatly enjoyed his time. He was from Oklahoma, but he greatly enjoyed his time in Pennsylvania. So he actually retired in Pennsylvania, in Gettysburg. And when he died, his daughters had this huge collection that he had acquired over the years. And they gave it to the Adams County Historical Society because they thought when they visited the camp while they were living there as children, that they were coming from Adams County and they were still in Adams County. They weren't. But at any rate, the Adams County Historical Society has willingly shared their collection with us. And many of the pictures that you're seeing in this slideshow are actually from that, from Major Thomas's collection. There were 8 trustees assigned to the camp. They stayed there the whole 30 months that the camp was opened. And it was usually because of a unique skill that they had. One was a barber. One was particularly good with horses. And they did keep horses at the camp for security purposes to ride the perimeter of the camp periodically. As I said before, there was only those 2 escapes and they weren't directly from the camp. The men who were being interrogated there were not there long enough to even figure out exactly where they were. But the interrogators at Pine Grove had a major task, and it was to separate prisoners into 8 separate groups. First of all, they separated the Navy from the other military. They separated the officers from the enlisted men. And then the real focus of their interrogations was to separate the staunch Nazis from just those German prisoners who were participating in the war because they felt it was their duty. This is a shot of the kitchen staff. Some of them were among those 8 trustees that were kept at the camp for the duration. One of them was a particularly fine artist. His name was Heinrich Bachhaus, and he was assigned to Major Thomas as his orderly. Before I talk a little bit more about him, I wanted to mention this gentleman. He was an MP at the camp, Robert Chastulik. He was wounded in Europe, and he thought when he got set back stateside, he would be released from the army. He wasn't. He was assigned as an MP and was sent to Pine Grove, pretty disgruntled in the beginning, but he eventually settled into his work there. He was from a town, Chambersburg, not very far away, about 20 miles away, but he was not allowed to tell his family where he was. It was a top secret operation. You could not access the camp. Local people could not access it. It was totally blocked off, different from many of the internment camps which were quite visible. And he did, though, during his months there, collect a large number of souvenirs from Germans that I guess he traded cigarettes or food rations or something to acquire these things. And his daughters now have that collection. It's a fairly substantial collection, including a German helmet. As I said earlier, the camp was divided in half toward the end of the war. And this is roll call for the Japanese prisoners on the west side of the camp. In all, the records that we reviewed, particularly John Bland reviewed in researching his book, he could only find records that showed 161 Japanese prisoners had ever been brought to the camp. Those same transportation records indicated that during the 30 months, more than 7,000 German prisoners were interrogated there. So it was a very large group and mainly focused on German prisoners. During the course of my work as librarian at the Historical Society, I was contacted by a former Japanese young woman whose father had been at Camp Michaud and wrote a memoir about his experiences as a Japanese soldier. He was older. He had more of a perspective, I guess, a worldwide perspective on what was going on in the world. Highly educated, but still, when he was drafted, he went into the military, and she shared that memoir with us, converting it to translating it to English. And we were able to publish a part of that, particularly the part that dealt with Pine Grove, in our annual journal that we published several years ago. It was published. I mentioned earlier that one of the prisoners.
David, wait, back to that Japanese story. So the really interesting element of this is he was captured at Iwo Jima.
Yes. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that.
Captured at Iwo Jima, we looked it up. There were 216 Japanese out of 22,000 that actually were captured. So a very unique man.
And he explains that in his memoir. Of course, in Japanese culture, to be a prisoner was a very negative thing to have happen to you. But he was so sick because they had not had enough food. He was hiding in a cave. And so when the military found him, they actually had to carry him out of the cave. So that was why he became a prisoner. And then he was shuttled, of course, to the West Coast. And then eventually, slowly, he was moved across the country and ends up at Pine Grove for a period of time. But the war ends, and of course, that ends that whole piece of the story as well. Major Thomas accompanied the Japanese prisoners back to Tokyo, and the prisoners requested that they not be taken into the main harbor but that they be released outside of the main area so they could blend back into Japanese society and not be identified as significant Japanese prisoners. So now back to Heinrich Backhaus. He painted this picture for Major Thomas. It was an overview of the camp, and it matches exactly to that 1945 map. So it's very authentic. It even has the fence dividing the camp in half, and an additional guard tower that was built to guard that section of the preserve. He also painted this. This is the log cabin that Major Thomas's headquarters and living facilities were at the camp, and there was a guard tower immediately outside of it. When you go to that site now, you can see the foundations for the log cabin and the bases, these concrete bases for the guard tower are still there. He signed the camp, the picture this way with his German PW. They didn't use POW back then, it was PW. And the 5th of October, 1945 is the date. That also happened, we think, because the prisoners at Pine Grove did not go out on work details outside the camp, because they were, the war was still going on. But after the war was over, here on the 22nd of May, they were sent out to work on the reservoir where the water impound was for the camp. And one of the prisoners inscribed this in the concrete. And there are numerous examples of this scattered around the camp where prisoners were out on work details, but it's always after May 8th. It's never before that we have any evidence of. So at the end of the war, the camp is shut down by November 28th. The last prisoners to leave are those 8 trustees. And as Glenn mentioned, they are all repatriated to Europe. And the state's looking for something to do with this site. And eventually 2 churches went together and formed a coalition, and they decided to name their church camp after the state forest that the camp was in, rather than after either one of their churches. So they decided on the name Camp Michaud. And this is what the camp looked like as it existed as a church camp. This is evening Vesper services on a site known as Vesper Hill up on the north side of the camp. This is the interior of that recreation building that we looked at earlier. Those paintings on the wall are German paintings. So a number of the prisoners, particularly the officers, did engage in doing artwork during their time at the camp. The only totally surviving feature of the camp is the CCC fountain. That's still there today. In fact, this is a contemporary picture of it. Other German works that we found out about is the woman holding this painting is Helen Garman. That's her mother and her as a child, and that was painted by a German prisoner. One of Chastulik's pieces that he has in his collection is this Japanese box, and this horse was also made for Helen Garman. And that's one of the pictures, we have about 8 of these that the Germans painted and were eventually hung on the walls of the recreation building. And the cover of that book that Glenn showed at the beginning of John Bland's book, that's also one of the German paintings. That was actually painted on the walls of the barracks that prisoner was staying in. And when the camp was dismantled in 1975, that had to be pulled off the wall. And so when you see that in our collection, you can see the nail holes where it had been nailed onto the walls. Part of that effort that I was involved with in developing the walking trails, where there was also sufficient money in that grant to apply for, and we were granted this state historical marker. So that now marks the site today. So if there are any questions, that concludes my remarks about Pine Grove Furnace Interrogation Camp.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much. Really an interesting piece of history right here in our own state. Let me ask you to take down the PowerPoint and stop share so we can, there we go. There we are. Thank you, David. So yeah, let's entertain any questions from the audience. Or Sean, did anything come up in the chat that would be addressed to David about Pine Grove?
Let's see. Barb asked, were there also vehicles used for security?
There was a road that circulated the camp. In fact, up near that water impound area, there were bridge abutments built. So yes, vehicles were used in addition to the horses. The horses, if there had been an escape, could have gotten more into the forest, but there was never a need for it. They were used more for recreation. One of the interrogators that I got to interview that was brought up from Fort Hunt remembered being able to ride those horses, and one of the people who helped him get on the horse and ride around the area was a former Nazi.
Ah, interesting.
Joe Fudd, I'm highlighting your video. You're giving us sort of a mini tour here.
Yeah, just this is a glance inside of the barracks in Amherst, Ohio. We were a little different than the main camp. We were one of the satellite work camps off of Camp Perry up in northern Ohio. We had 23 German prisoners that were here from about mid-1944 until the end of 45. They were working in the stone quarries. They had 2 guards with them, so it's kind of a very it's kind of hard to get a lot of the nitty-gritty details of it, but what we do know is they must have been pretty well behaved because they were able to get out onto the town, and they were relatively less supervised than probably most of the camps, having just 2 guards for 23 men. But it was definitely a cool little gem that we found in our town that we've turned into a museum. Kind of done it for Christmas at the moment, though.
Joe, is this the actual insides of the building, or is this a recreation?
This is the actual inside of the building that we had. It went from, it started out actually the train, when they were raising the train tracks in town, they built this building at the turn of the century. And then once they completed that project, it had sat empty by the tracks until World War II, when the manpower shortage over in this area and basically everywhere from Sandusky to Cleveland, there's a lot of stone quarries out here, and the manpower shortage was a big problem. So having already a lot of German-speaking people in the quarries out here, it was an ideal place to put German prisoners that, could go out on the public with less supervision than usual. So the Army commandeered the building in, I believe it was April of 44. And from then on, they assigned 23 German prisoners and two guards to be here at this barracks. So this was actually a barracks. We started in the process of turning it back into its original configuration. Unfortunately, this building's missing about 10 feet because when they moved it from the tracks to the historical society, they had cut it in half and had it attached to another barn. So we had to put it back together, and now we're in the process of, adding the wood burners back in that were there originally, and all the bunks and all that good stuff.
Look very much like U.S. Army issue bunks, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
And Joe Conroy, do you reenact in this barracks?
Yes, I'm one of the participants here. A lot of those uniforms you're actually seeing on the wall are ones I painted. And that's actually my overcoat right there in the brown wool. But yes, I reenact a German prisoners of war living in the United States, and I live in this barracks several times a year for up to 3 or 4 days in a row. We live and we interpret for the public, playing the role of a German prisoner of war. So people can come through, we talk to them, give them a brief explanation of why we're there, who we are. Oh, that actually is a original German mess kit. I'm not sure how well you can see it on the video. That was engraved by a person who was a prisoner of war in the United States. So it doesn't show up quite well in there, but we have many original items of items that were carved. For example, that. that were carved or created by prisoners of war, and we display them so the public may see what items prisoners of war owned, what they wore, and just a little bit of detail here and there that people can actually see and say, hey, here's something that was held and used by a prisoner of war.
Joe, are you dressed in costume, if that's the right word?
Yes, I am.
I'm gonna replace Spotlight. Joe, there we go.
There we are. Okay.
So, prisoners of war who were brought to the United States were, of course, wearing their German uniforms. They landed at Pier 84 in New York City, had their uniforms deloused and cleaned, and they were put on a train. And when they arrived at their camp, they were issued a set of U.S. Army issued clothes. When they got them, they were brand new from the factory Army issued clothing, but they were issued paint and stencils as well, and said you have to add the markings PW to both sleeves and the back of all your uniforms, as well as the front thighs and the seat of your trousers. They were also given, in addition to the standard khaki U.S. Army uniforms, U.S. Class A 4-button wool tunics dyed black or dark blue to signify that they were prisoners of war. The colors of PW markings were either white, black, or orange, depending on the base color of the uniform. And we've tried to recreate that the best we can with, if you've seen in the videos, walking around the barracks of what prisoners wore. And the German prisoners of war actually talked about, wow, we're getting new clothes. This is absolutely fantastic. When they got to a barracks, they would receive 2 pairs of U.S. Army khaki uniforms, 2 pairs of denim uniforms, a pair of U.S. Army boots, 4 pairs of underwear, 2 blankets, a toothbrush, and a cap. And they even got U.S. Army 41 jackets, Jeep caps, you name it, they got it at one point. They were amazed with what they got, but that's all I can say.
Wow. Wow. And on the shelf behind you, those are gas masks. What else?
Yes, I collected various. I'm in front of the German area right now, so that was appropriate for a night. German gas masks of various models, the canisters they were within. This is more or less every model of gas mask the Germans used between 1933 and 45. The various different models of canisters that were used. There's even more up there that you can't see and more off that way. And then helmets of various makes and models over here. And then American stuff is over there and British stuff is over there. They got a little bit of everything.
Where again exactly is this location?
Oh, this is my private collection.
So party at Joe's house later tonight to finish the Penn State game. Okay.
Yeah, this is my private collection, but the location Joe Fott is in is where we interpret as prisoners of war.
And where exactly is that located?
It is in Amherst, Ohio. I could more or less, that doesn't mean anything. It's a suburb of Cleveland. That's how I would describe it. It's on the western side of Cleveland in Ohio.
If you could put the in the chat room after a while, just put an address in or a website for us or whatever, that would be helpful for anybody.
Yeah.
If I'm in a neighborhood, am I invited in to take a look at your private collection?
Yeah, I mean, we could. That actually something we talked to Joe Fott. He's one of the board members of the Historical Society there.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Oh no, yeah, it's perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly acceptable.
Every once in a while to watch the Steelers beat up on the Browns. So maybe as a side trip, I could.
Hey, we're on the eastern side of Ohio, so we see ourselves as more Steelers fans here. But I'm not a sports guy personally, so.
Well, Joe and Joe, thank you very much. This is a great surprise. Barb, thank you for bringing them to our attention. Very well done. Thank you.
And Matthew Rector, you work at Fort Knox. Barbara said you had knowledge of German POWs at Fort Knox with 5 or 6 buried on post.
Well, I used to work at Fort Knox. I was there for over 19 years before I moved up here to Amherst, Ohio, and was thankfully placed in touch with the Historical Society. But no, yeah, my experience at Fort Knox, Kentucky as a historic preservation officer, I was able to do a lot of research about the main POW camp there, where there are upwards to 4,000 POWs. 18 are actually buried at the post cemetery, 17 German and 1 Italian. But during my course there, I was able to interact with I don't know, a half dozen to 10 former German POWs and their families. So learned a lot of firsthand stories and gleaned a lot of history from them.
Excellent.
I'll say at Fort Knox, the camp is no longer there. It was dismantled. But the one thing that exists at Fort Knox, and you can look at it at an aerial, is that the high school football field used to be their soccer field. So that's the one extant aspect of the camp that still exists today.
Was that common, do you know, Matt, that some of the POW internment camps were on U.S. military bases like that?
Yes. Yeah. So in Kentucky, at least, you had several others at Camp Campbell and Camp Breckenridge. So, the infrastructure was there. The Army had a good capability to take care of them. So at least in my experience, yeah. Now you did have branch camps in smaller Kentucky towns that maybe didn't have that infrastructure, but the infrastructure would travel with them.
I guess where now I better understand the confusion about the number of camps, because there were so many different types of camps and branch
Right.
camps, and maybe a local camp like the one there in Amherst was just for that workforce, for that quarry. So it depends how you count them.
Yeah, it took me a long time to get a handle on actually how many POWs came through Fort Knox just because of that, because they're, moving them around to area camps.
Yeah. And largely, both David and Matt I'd ask this if it's a correct comment. Largely, the German POWs, other than the hardcore Nazis, which were separated and held at a couple of specific places, they were largely passive. This is not like in Germany where the Allied prisoners of war were doing everything they could to break out, especially early in the war. So that passivity made it, how do I want to say, security was not a huge issue for us in keeping those POWs. Is that accurate?
I would agree with that. A number of stories that we've been told over the years is that the Germans who were prisoners were in much better shape. Nobody was shooting at them. They were better fed than they were when they were, and clothed than they were in Europe. So being a prisoner, other than the hardcore Nazi, was probably a good thing, not a bad thing.
And in fact, Glenn, in John's book about Pine Grove, he tells stories of German POWs who are writing home and telling their relatives to not send them care packages. Keep the food for yourself. You need it in Germany. We are well fed here. We are well taken care of here. We don't need your care packages. I think that says a lot about how they were treated as prisoners.
Yeah. Okay.
One story that doesn't exactly relate to that, but that I always found interesting is the Germans who came into that site in New York City were absolutely amazed that it was still standing because they had been told that it had been bombed.
New York City had been bombed.
Yeah.
Sean, unless there's something else to address from the audience, why don't we take a station break? Oh, I see a hand up.
Gretchen? Sorry, my children are screaming down the stairs. Gretchen, did you have your hand up? Yep. All right, I'll ask you to unmute.
And Don Pat.
Did it unmute? Okay, there it is.
There you go.
I'm wondering if David is there a museum or something at Pine Grove State Park, or how do you?
There's a
small close by, or
there's a small collection at the state park, but if you really want to see some of the things that I've been talking about, you need to come to the Cumberland County Historical Society's museum in Carlisle. Okay. And there, one of those German paintings, interestingly enough, a painting of the Statue of Liberty. And some people look at it and think it looks like they're trying to put Hitler's head on the statue, but but at any rate, Statue of Liberty. There's also one of those paintings that Bachhaus did, and several other items. And of course, if you have a particular deep interest, some of the other things can be pulled out to examine that are kept in storage.
We had a POW camp way up the northern part of New Hampshire, and an old CCC camp. It was just a work camp, and they replaced the lumberman who had enlisted.
Right.
And the townspeople, it's just a little bitty town, but they invited the Germans to come to church, and then would have them come to their homes afterwards for dinner, and they became very friendly, and they would go back after the war. One
Yeah.
year they'd go to Germany, and the next year they'd come to the United States, and they were very, very close. They
Yeah.
wanted to stay, but of course, Geneva Conventions required that they leave, that they all be returned home. But they stayed very friendly as long as they lived.
Well, thank you very much. There's a couple other people with their hands raised. Let's get to them. I saw Don Patton. Don, I think you're unmuted.
Yes, I am. One thing that I would like to highlight, this is a book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America by Arnold Kremer. He was actually a professor at Texas A&M where I graduated, and so I spent considerable time. I think from the standpoint of the overall Nazi prisoner of war, this is the definitive book. In the appendix, it lists the major and camps. Back several years ago, our World War II Roundtable here in Minnesota did a program, and I found a couple of American soldiers that had been guards. One was actually retired as a colonel. He was a guard at a camp in the Hartford, Connecticut area, although it is not listed in Arnold Kremer's book. As I recall, and again, failing old memory, if I can say that, that camp is basically where I think it's called the Bradley Air Base is in the Hartford area currently. I had another guard at a predominantly Italian, and as I recall, he was somewhere in Montana. But the Kremer's book lists the kind of the chronological profile of German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners just from 42, actually 41, with the one Japanese, of course, that was captured from the submarine.
He was prisoner number one, yeah.
Prisoner number one, exactly. When we did our program with the Hartford Guard, the Montana Guard, some way the word got out, and we actually ended up with a couple of Germans that had been not repatriated. They had come back. One of them ended up starting a cemetery monument business in Madison, Wisconsin, and he came over and spoke at our program about being a POW. This was one of our early programs. I'm not even sure if we recorded it, and I really regret, because we actually have another gentleman who went to school. He actually teaches at a St. Thomas Academy, an all-male military prep school here in Minnesota. He wrote a book called, I think it's Spears to Plowshares. He went to school in Trier and interrogated a lot of German prisoners that had been in the prisons of the States. One real key fact that I didn't hear said tonight, one of the reasons for bringing so many of the prisoners back to the States is when we were taking all the logistics over there, we didn't want to burden that additional logistics load by having prisoners there. So we brought them back on the empty ships.
Yeah.
that became the
Yeah.
basis of the hundreds of thousands that being here.
We took cargo over there and brought back. Thank you, Don, so very much. Let me go to Bob, and then we're going to go to Carole for the last part of the presentation. Bob?
All right. Yes, thank you, sir. Camp Blanding, west of Jacksonville, was a military base that housed German prisoners. I started with the Florida National Guard after I got out of active duty in '75, and there was still barracks, with foundations, etc. And they said there were some graves out there. I mean, this is like 50 years ago, but at that point, I wouldn't doubt it. The other thing is, I watched the YouTube shows on the different prisoners coming over, and it seemed like some of them got some real lax supervision. This one guy that ended up in New Mexico traveled all over the California, all the way up, pulling sugar beets out of Minnesota or whatever. But on a convoy going from New Mexico to California, he was in a Jeep. A PFC, U.S. PFC was driving with two other Germans in the Jeep. And the PFC said, I'm going to go ride with my buddies. Here, you drive the Jeep. And so he traded seats with another German prisoner from the other Jeep. And they got all the way to the border up in California. And they're saying, what are we going to do? We got 4 Germans driving a Jeep. And they got separated from everybody. And it took, several phone calls to Washington and everywhere and they let them go on their way. Then they got lost in California, and they flagged somebody down. This guy could speak perfect English, and they ended up getting directed. The guy says, follow me, and he drove them directly to the front gate. And so I would say, that was kind of lax. Nobody else, there was no repercussions from that, but it was kind of strange. This guy was doing his own narrative when he had come back to the U.S. So
Well, thank you, Bob. That's interesting background. Thank you. So,
yes,
listen,
sir. Thank you.
If we could take our very brief station break, then we'll go finish with Carole. Sean, and I think you'll be happy. Everybody will be happy to know we have a briefer version of all this.
Much briefer now.
More brief.
More brief, the briefest. So VBC Magazine, we send this out quarterly. It's absolutely 100% free. We print this up, ship it to your mailboxes. If we don't have your address, then we can't send it to you. So please send us your address. We are happy to send this out to you. What you see on the left is What is a Veteran? That was our most recent fall magazine. The next one, The Oath, History, and Meaning, that'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks, as it will be going to the printer soon. This is a really wonderful, about 35-page read of a lot of the stories we hear with VBC, but we hear a lot of great things about our magazine, a lot of good reviews. So please, if you'd like to receive it, just let us know. And we're even happy to send more than one copy. We could send 10, 25, whatever you like. If you'd like to hand them out in your community, it's a great way to get the word out about what we do. Just some upcoming programs, continuing sort of this POW idea, but through Vietnam. We have the story of Vietnam POW Doug Hegdahl. That will be on Monday night, 7 p.m., same Zoom channel here. And then next Thursday night, we will have World War II in the Caribbean back here with Glenn. So real quick, real easy programs coming up, really interesting stuff. And then Glenn, we also have, I'm gonna let you share, we also have a tour coming up, correct?
Correct. Let me share just a real quick announcement about that. Are we seeing that okay?
Yes.
So I think we've talked about this just a bit, but not a lot, but we are taking a group to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The dates are April 7th to 11th. It's 4 nights. We have 24, I think, people signed up. We're looking for 30 people. We have nonstop direct air from Pittsburgh on Breeze Air included in this. So it's $1,700, both the land portion and the air portion. We do have some people coming not from Pittsburgh, from other locations. So they're finding their own way, just taking the land portion. So it's 4 nights. It's April 7th to 11th. this is all on the website. If you're interested, please just take a look at the website and let us know if you'd like to come with us to New Orleans. Okay, Carole, we are going to get to you now.
Okay.
And I think we got.
Well, Glenn's pulling up my presentation. I want to give a quick shout out to our friends at the Bedford County Historical Society. County Historical Societies loom large in tonight's program. And the director, Kimberly Pepple, and two volunteers, Dr. Raymond Jackson and Pat Harrison, helped me find all the documentation I needed to pull together the story tonight I have for you about why keep Japs at luxury resort. I pulled that title directly from a headline that you're going to see shortly. And the underlying question is a little bit more specific. What were the Japanese doing in Bedford, Pennsylvania? The answer to that is pretty easy. Next slide, Glenn. Location, location, location.
There we go.
Bedford is located near the southern border of Pennsylvania. You can see it there sort of in the lower portion of the state. If Glenn can navigate you there. Yeah. And it's not too far actually from Pine Grove as well. Pine Grove is right below the H in Harrisburg there. So they were fairly close to each other. That was just coincidental. The proximity of Bedford to Washington, D.C., like Pine Grove, made it an ideal location for what the State Department had planned there. The State Department was in charge of this particular project because they were dealing with a diplomatic corps, not a military group. And they were looking for a hotel rather than a barracks. Again, in following the Geneva Conventions, they wanted accommodations that were a little bit more suitable for a diplomatic corps, and they found it at Bedford Springs. In the next slide, you see a photograph of what the resort looks like today. And I wanted to use this picture early so that you could see this beautiful building with the beautiful portico. This is the main part of the hotel and kind of original to the property. And this was one of the buildings that was used to house the Japanese detainees while they were at Bedford Springs. Bedford Springs is a National Historic Landmark. It has a great story that's hundreds of years old. I encourage you to look it up and find out those details, which we don't have time to go over tonight. But this is how the property looked in 2006 when it was just finished with its most recent renovation. This is not how it looked during World War II. On the next slide, you'll see how it looked in the 1940s. There you see the headline that I stole for my program title. In the early 1940, a group of developers acquired the property and they were intending to turn it back into kind of a vacation spot for civilians. But the Navy had a different idea. They commandeered the property to set up the Keystone Naval Training School, which operated from 1942 to 1945 on the Bedford Resort property. It was specific for the training of naval radio operators, and they actually graduated 6,000 radio operators from this location. So you can picture what the place might have looked like after the Navy was there with their trainees. When the State Department found out then that the Navy was vacating the property in 1945, they considered it desirable for their purposes for the Japanese diplomatic group. So they came to the property with the FBI and started refurbishing it for the needs of this particular project. Now in the picture on the far right, where you see all those white columns on the building behind the trees, that is the main building of the hotel and what we're going to be calling Building A. Japanese were interned there. The building on the left is the dormitory that was for employees of the resort when they needed to be on property for extended periods of time. The building above it on the hillside, obviously, is a building called the Annex, and that was the second building that was used to house the Japanese internees. So we can get a better view of the whole property on the next slide, kind of a bird's eye view. There you see Building A plunked in the middle of the diagram there. And up above it on the hillside, that V-shaped building is the annex. So that's where the Japanese were kept. To the right of the main building is building C. And it's my understanding that's where a lot of the government employees who were supervising this whole operation were staying. Dormitory is still where it was on the picture. You'll also notice that there are black dots scattered throughout the property. And those are the locations of all the sentries and guard posts. For all the elevation that the property has, it was a well-guarded property. Nobody was going anywhere. The other thing I want to point out on this diagram, because it plays into the story of the community's reaction to this project, is US Route 220, which Glenn is outlining for you there on the southern perimeter of the property. This was a road that was not, even though it was near to the property, it wasn't blocked in any way because it's a main artery into downtown Bedford, and you couldn't really block it off and have normal commerce going on there. So now we know why the Japanese were brought here. Proximity to DC and a facility that was already sort of ready to receive them. And we know where they were located on the property. It's time to ask who was actually brought there. On the next slide, you see the rundown that I was able to put together from National Archives records. And it's everybody from the ambassador to the Japanese ambassador to Germany, to cooks and students and clerks and secretaries and hairdressers and all those kinds of support staff, shall we say. They had been rounded up as the Allies were advancing on Berlin, both from the east and the west. Some were caught as they were trying to escape. They were picked up in Sweden, in Austria, in Switzerland. And as far as I've been able to determine, everybody that they wanted to get from the Japanese embassy in Berlin, they did get in this delegation. So it was 119 men, 29 women, 37 children. And the numbers are around 180 to 185. Again, as we've all noted in our presentations tonight, the numbers vary based on the date of the document you happen to be looking at sometimes. But a reliable number is between 180 and 185 were in this delegation. The most important member of this delegation was our blue chip POW, Hiroshi Oshima. His career as a soldier and a diplomat is outlined for you there. I'm just going to comment on a couple of the bullet points in particular. I found it interesting that during his stay in Berlin in the early 1930s, those who knew him felt that he was more a Nazi than the Nazis. So we know we're not dealing with a humanitarian here or a kind-hearted gentleman. He was also part of the inner circle, friends with von Ribbentrop, Hitler's personal confidant, and this gave him some pretty good access to German war plans. He had been taken to the Eastern Front, and he had also been given a grand tour of the Atlantic Wall in November of 1943. What Oshima didn't know was that this made him a very valuable source of Allied intelligence because of a device he was using that is pictured on the next slide. This is the actual purple diplomatic cipher device that Hiroshi Oshima used to send dispatches back to Tokyo of all of his operations in Berlin. And he was prolific. During his tenure, the Allies, who had broken the Purple Code in 1940, before we were even at war with Japan, intercepted over 1,400 of his messages and were able to use them for military intelligence. Among those dispatches were detailed reports about the results of Allied bombing raids, pretty accurate too, and very objective. So it gave the Allies a pretty good idea of where they were succeeding and not succeeding in their air raids. But one of the gemstones of the intercepted messages was his 20-page report on his visit to the Atlantic Wall. He told Tokyo everything: the location of every German division, the manpower and weaponry they had available. He had detailed descriptions of the tank ditches. So there was no detail left out. Valuable intelligence information as the invasion was being planned. And then 1 week before D-Day, Oshima sent a dispatch to Tokyo after a private conversation with Hitler, in which Hitler told him he believed that the invasion was coming at the Pas de Calais, and that he had shifted the large lion's share of his troops in that direction. So a week before D-Day, the Allies knew that the ruse was working and that it was likely Normandy was going to be a big surprise. Ironically, even though von Ribbentrop in particular had been warning Oshima that he needed to be very careful about his dispatches, he had total confidence in Purple. He felt he was 100% secure, wasn't worried. He didn't know, even when he died, that he had been the biggest leak in Berlin. In 1975, when he passed away, this was still classified information that the code had been broken. So Oshima never knew that all of his transmissions had been intercepted. He was, after the war, tried as a war criminal. He was considered one of 4 blue chip Japanese POWs, and he was sentenced. He only served a couple of years of his life sentence. He was out by 1955. But he was, a real catch in this delegation, and proved to be useful in the State Department trying to quell some of the anxiety about the Japanese coming. So now we know who. Let's see how the community responded to this. When the rumors started flying that something was going up at Bedford Springs, you had protests almost immediately in Bedford and in the surrounding communities, Johnstown, Altoona. The American Legion Post and the VFWs were particularly active on that front. The State Department got concerned and invited any locals who wanted to come to the resort 3 weeks before anybody arrived there from the detainee group. And they took them on a tour so that they could see it was not a country club, it wasn't luxurious, and answered all their questions, and pretty much squelched a lot of the anxiety that the communities were having about this happening in their own backyard. The State Department also took the opportunity to share that the reason they wanted to be careful with these detainees was that they were bargaining chips for possible better treatment of Allied prisoners in the Pacific Theater. And for one in particular, they thought they'd be able to trade Oshima for General Wainwright, who was still captive in the Philippines. With that information, the townspeople said, okay, we get it. We got to treat these people right. It could benefit our own guys over there. At that time, there were still 14,000 US nationals, military and non-military, in Japanese POW camps. So the first arrivals were Oshima and his immediate entourage, and they arrived on August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, 1 day before Nagasaki. Also significant because now the community was also starting to feel maybe the war is going to end soon and we don't need to worry about this so much. There were no acts of violence that I was able to find in this story. Acts of what I would call defiance more than violence. Vendors who had been providing meat and dairy products and other supplies to the resort said they would not do that while the Japanese were there. So there were little boycotts and acts of defiance, but nothing violent. Here's where Route 220 comes in. What you did have was drive-by harassment. The community was famous for organizing motorcades to just drive up and down Route 220 on the perimeter of the property with megaphones, bullhorns, whatever they could get their hands on, and verbally harass the Japanese. I've seen no documentation that the Japanese ever heard this or were bothered by it, but I think it probably let off a lot of steam in the community. Now, despite the community concerns, these were detainees. They were being detained. They were not being entertained on the property. Many of them arrived with lots of missing luggage, including a lot of basic necessities. They were behind 7-foot-high fences and guarded all day and night. They had no access to the resort amenities, the trails, the swimming pools, the tennis court, the golf course, none of that. They were pretty much confined to quarters. They were expected to pay their own way If they needed toiletries and things that they could get at a little shop that was set up for them, they had to buy it for themselves with their own money. They were fed cafeteria style on government rations. They did not have an executive chef. There were a few births during their stay. There were several attempted divorces, which I'll address on the next slide, and one death. A cook who had accompanied the entourage died of a heart attack. His cremated remains were kept at Bedford and returned to Japan with the rest of the entourage when they left. And that became the next pressing question. When are they getting out of here? The war's over now. VJ Day has happened. We want them to go. And that wasn't just the community. The State Department was getting kind of antsy about it too. So at this point, there were European spouses of many of the Japanese in the delegation. And some of them started petitioning to be sent back to Europe, not to be sent to Japan. They didn't know Japan. They didn't want to go there. Some of them tried divorcing their spouses while they were here to indicate they wanted separated and they didn't want to go to Japan. None of that was accepted by the State Department. Of all the petitions, only one was accepted, in this one person, Irmgard Yamamoto, no relation to the admiral as far as I know, was sent back to Europe, but she was the only one of this delegation who was granted her request. Everyone else was pretty much given a couple hours notice to round up their belongings on November 15th. And then on November 16th, they were bused to a train depot for a 4-day trip to Seattle. They arrived in Seattle on the 20th of November, and they left the very next day for Japan. At that point, the resort was turned back to the developers so that they could resume their plans to remodel it and turn it into a vacation spot for civilians. So after all the research and everything I've been doing on this, I have two little PSs to add to this. One that I'm kind of perturbed about. I discovered in talking to the concierge at the Bedford Springs Resort that the booklet that is published and kept on the property and around the town that tells the story of the historic resort, and not just this chapter, but other chapters as well. The chapter in the most recent edition that was just published, the chapter on the Japanese detention, has been deleted. And they don't know why. We can speculate. I have my opinions about it, but I'm very disappointed in that, because I think this is actually a very important chapter in the story of that site and a very successful operation when all was said and done. My second point is that this started, as we told you at the very beginning, with my question to Glenn: how was the treatment of Axis POWs compared to the treatment of Allied POWs? And I think everything you've heard tonight tells you there was a dramatic difference. And that's something that I left this whole process feeling very proud of the way America responded, even though many were awkward and uncomfortable about their enemy being in their backyard. I think by and large, as a country, we handled it very well. And it's something that made me very proud. But I also learned the valuable lesson: be careful when you send Glenn Flickinger a question in an email, because you could end up with 6 months of homework. I have learned that lesson too. Thanks for listening. This was a wonderful journey, including a trip to Bedford Historical Society to do some on-site research. The people there were wonderful, and I really appreciate all the help they provided and all the paper they sent me back with.
Thank you very much, Carole. Thanks very much. And thank David too, as well. We've gone a little past our bewitching hour, but let's take any questions that anybody might have or comments in the chat room. Sean?
There's two interesting things. Peggy Schulberg. Peggy, I'm going to highlight I'll ask you to unmute and I'll highlight your screen and let us know what you wanted to show us.
Sure. I have, my mother served as a dietitian overseas in France in World War II. And in the hospital, in the kitchen, or in the mess, really, it was the German PWs that staffed. So she would supervise them. And this is a box that was given to her as a gift from one of the PWs. All he had was a file, a hammer, and a saw. And I've had this in my living room. I wouldn't open it, but I might not get it shut again. So it's pretty intricate carving. I just thought I would show.
Thank you. It's quite a treasure to have.
Thank you very much. And also, Joe Fott, I asked you to start your video again. I asked you to unmute. I'll spotlight you. Let's see here. There were, let's see here. Hold on a second. Barb, you mentioned that there were hand drawings that Joe Conroy has done. I don't know if you're still there.
Yeah, I think Joe Fott must have made it home.
Oh, Joe.
In the barracks, there were.
It got a little cold in the barracks.
Yeah, Joe Conroy from Youngstown, with all the paraphernalia behind him. He had drawn wartime pictures, etchings, and they were posted on the walls. There he is, on the walls of the barracks there, and they were so well done. I was hoping that Joe Fott would get close-ups of them. Awesome, Joe. Don't be embarrassed.
Joe Conroy, yeah. Barb asked, I don't know if you have any that you like to hold up to the yeah, you can hold it up to the camera.
A little hard.
Maybe tilt it. Oh, yeah.
There you are. Yeah. Wow. Some real talent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exceptional.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Reminds me of some of the POW stories we had of American or Allied POWs in Germany and the artwork they did. We saw quite a bit of that. I mean, these men had a lot of time on their hands, and some of them are quite talented. So,
and Ghost Army. Yeah.
Peggy Kelly, you had your hand up. Oh, go ahead, Peggy. It's hard to hear you. Give it a shot. No, we can't hear you, Peggy. There might be a problem with your microphone.
Peggy's already been on.
Let's go to Greg Yost, maybe.
Greg, I'll ask you to unmute.
Yes, thank you all so much for this great presentation. Carole, your question was well rewarded tonight. We all appreciate the 6 months of work that we thank you for asking that question and all that you had to go through. So my understanding is, well, of course, the German POWs who worked off base a lot of times for private, for farms or in the hospital, as was mentioned. The payment did not go directly to them. It went to the camps, and the prisoner himself would get a small amount, whatever, to use in the store, etc. My understanding is that the camps were the unions and the politicians required that those wages be basically union wages because they didn't want the POWs undercutting the local labor supply, the people who were not fighting in the war. So for all practical purposes, there was no financial gain for anyone to hire a German POW. So they all got union wages. That money was so significant, they paid it to the camps. My understanding is that prisoner of war camps turned a profit. They actually paid for themselves. So during World War II, this was one of the great capitalist enterprises of the United States, that the POW camps made money, paid for themselves, and contributed some back to the war effort. Rather interesting. So
that is interesting, Greg. Thank you. And who else do we have that might want to make a couple last comments before we stop?
Joe Conroy?
Mine is actually in regards to the payment of prisoners of war. So German prisoners of war for a full day of work were paid 80 cents a day. Of course, this pay was not directly given to them. The Americans were afraid that the German prisoners of war, if they escaped, they would use the U.S. money as like they would save it up, and then try to escape and use the money. So German prisoners of war got what was called camp script. It was paper money that was specific to each camp you were within. It was marked with what camp you were from, and they were allowed to use that only within the camp. And they were allowed to use it to buy things at the camp canteens. So whether that be razor blades, Coca-Cola, ice cream, even alcohol in certain points. But they were paid 80 cents, but it was never received in US dollars. And they could also have savings accounts that they could put money into. And when they got over into Germany, back home after the war, they could actually withdraw that money and get it in German marks.
Oh.
That's just a quick remark I thought I would
Sounds
mention.
like the model of the American company town and company store.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of examples of that where these guys would work exactly like that. Yeah. And there's the funniest thing is I've talked to many people who came to the museum that we volunteer at who give us stories about their family experience with working with German prisoners. And the German prisoners would actually get picked up by civilians who would show up in farm vehicles and say, all right, I need 11 German prisoners of war. And they would get 11 German prisoners of war, put them in the back of a pickup truck, give them one guard and say, you guys are going out for the day. They would leave at 7 in the morning, have a lunch at 12 o'clock, and come back at 4:30. And they were completely to the own devices of one man. We talked to one son of a prisoner of war guard here in Ohio, and he had been excluded from service overseas because he had a bad back. And he said the German prisoners of war would get up into the truck. He would hand up his rifle to them. They would take the rifle out, put it on the bed of the truck. He would stick up his arms, and the German prisoner of war would pull him up into the truck and then hand him back his gun. And when they got to the farm, they would lower him down and then hand him his shotgun. And then he said he would unload his shotgun, put the shells in his pocket, lean the shotgun up against a tree, and he said he would sleep the entire day. And he said one of the Germans would come over to him at the end of the day, kick his leg, and tell him, come on, we want to go back to camp. He would reload his shotgun, give it back to the prisoners of war, get back in the truck, and then go back to the camp. And they did that every day from 44 till 46. So that's just how it was for some of these camps. Heck, at local to give you one more anecdote, the local camp that we volunteer at in Amherst, which was a satellite camp, it was only 23 Germans, and it was a large German population. They permitted German prisoners of war to go into town completely unguarded on leave and go to the local soda bars, the movie theaters, and if they had good behavior, they would be completely unguarded and allowed to go into town for a day. Just an example of how well treated they were here, but that's my bit.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, one thing to remember, and I think I have this number about right, 30 to 35% of the American population was of German ancestry at that time. So a lot of German-speaking Americans, right?
The population of Amherst was very German at the time. For a fun fact, the Lutheran Church in Amherst actually raised money and bought all of the German prisoners of war in town thermoses during the Christmas of 1945. So that was just something of how well entwined the German community was with the German prisoners of war in our local town. It just goes to show you how well some of these guys had it. And they're like, wow, this is very great here. Yeah, it was really down into some of these local communities. And the Germans were so well treated that I've actually read as the German prisoner of war camps were called the Fritz Ritz by many members of the public, as in the Ritz Hotel. But of course, the Americans had to change that after the war ended, and still got the best part of it.
Joe, thank you. I think we ought to hang this up here. It's gotten to be almost 8:40. Yeah. So thank you all so very much for participating. Carole, thank you so much. I know you'll never ask me another question. I fixed that. Really good. David Smith, you've just a fountain of knowledge about Pine Grove Furnace Interrogation Center and its whole history. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Please, if you can, tune in to our future programs. If you're interested in more veteran programs, we'd love to have you and anybody else from Cumberland County. I've driven through Cumberland County 10,000 times, I have to tell you. Maybe one day I'll stop.
You're welcome.
And Sean, thank you as always. Joe, and Matt, what a great surprise. Barbara, thank you for bringing them on. And Sean, anything else? We'll say goodnight.
Say goodnight. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you Monday night for our next program. Have a great night, everybody.
Excellent presentation.
All right.